Father Jason's Signalness, Decree on the Means of Social Communication, February 23rd, 2013.
I've been asked today to speak on the document Inter Mirifica, Decree on the Means of Social Communications. And what I'm going to do in the course of my presentation, at first I'm going to give you a little introduction, then an overview, then a summary of some important points from the document. I'll just kind of walk through it. It's a very short document, I believe probably the shortest of the documents from the Council. And then I'll talk about two case studies that illustrate some important points: the March for Life media coverage and the coverage of the Second Vatican Council itself. And then at the end I'll conclude and have a few moments for questions. Okay, so as means of introduction here, we know that Jesus has given us all the command to go out, go into the whole world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. And so we all, as baptized Christians, have that duty. And we exercise it in many, many different ways, by the way we live our lives, by what we say, and also by how we say it. Over the last century, rapidly changing technology has constantly altered the way that we communicate with each other. Consequently, the way we carry out this duty to share the gospel is also changing in a certain way. So going from, ancient clay tablets to parchment to the TV to the internet to mobile devices that are always connected, these things have had profound effects on many different things, for better or for worse. And just like so many other things, these are tools that can be used for good or for ill. And the Church, like a good parent, wants to protect us from what is harmful, what is evil, and wants to guide us towards what is good and virtuous. And when it comes to communications, the Church has always had something to say. Going back to 1931, when Vatican Radio was established, then 1936, Pius XI came out with a document on television, or on motion pictures. Then in 1957, there was a document on movies, TV, and radio. In 1963, early in the Council, this document, which I'm talking about today, Inter Mirifica, was promulgated. Then the World Communications Day. Every year, the Holy Father, beginning in 1967 on, the Holy Father has had a little reflection on the current state of communications. And that's been a great godsend to us. If we read those documents now, like we can read what Pope Benedict had to say this last year about social networking, and then in the previous years about the value of silence and the true nature of friendship, and how things like Facebook and so on are affecting that notion in society. In 1971, there was a document on a pastoral instruction on social communications. 1975, a document on evangelization. 1986, there was a guide to the training of seminarians in social communications. Apparently they were watching too much TV, so they had to tell them to turn it off. If you read the document, it actually does talk about that. 1992, there was another pastoral instruction. Then there's documents in 2000, 2002, 2005. The Church has had a lot to say about this subject, and for purposes of brevity, I'll only focus on the one document today, which kind of set the groundwork for everything that was to follow. So, the first thing we might notice is the title, Inter Mirifica, of this document. As you might know, documents promulgated by the Holy See typically take their name in Latin from the first words of the document. And one translation of that is "among the wonderful." And the first sentence of the document is, "Among the wonderful technological discoveries, the Church welcomes and promotes with special interest those which have a most direct relation to men's minds and which have uncovered new avenues for communicating most readily news, views, and teachings of every sort." So right off you see they're pretty positive about this. They're hopeful that all this new technology is going to be useful. Now, right at the beginning of the document, as I said, we'll kind of step through it, they define kind of what they mean when they say the means of social communication. It's a very broad term. Those means of communication, which by their nature can reach and influence not merely single individuals, but the very masses, and even the whole of human society. These are the press, the cinema, the radio, television, and other of like nature. Now, this was published in '63, so now we're talking about the internet and all of its related technologies as well. Then this other quote, also at the beginning of the document, "The Church, our mother, knows that if these media are properly used, they can be of considerable benefit to mankind. But the Church also knows it can use them in ways that are contrary to the Creator's design and damaging to himself." So we can see that they're very hopeful, the Council Fathers, about technology and communications technology, but they're also not naive. They know there are problems and dangers. Risk in misusing these technologies, we risk damaging our very selves. So beginning here in chapter 1, we find, there's really only, I think, 2 chapters in this document. The first chapter, they really focus on rights of the people, obligations, and morality involved in the different aspects of communication. They talk about the Church's birthright to use and own any of these media which are necessary or useful. The Church is claiming the birthright. It has the right to use these new communications to spread its message. It repeatedly says pastors of souls have the task of instructing the faithful on how to use these media in a safe manner. And I would say maybe we haven't done that because people do not know, or they don't often critically evaluate what it is they're watching and reading and speaking about. They talk about the task that laymen have to animate the media with a Christian human spirit. More on that in the next hour on the apostolate of the laity from Dr. Gerlach. And this was important too. They also are frequently referring to the fact that we have a right to receive information like news that is true, that is complete, and that is honestly communicated. Then they had an interesting reflection on a few different things. The rights of art versus moral order. Calling it art does not mean that you can do whatever you want. There's been some pretty disturbing, I was thinking of putting pictures of some of these things on. No, they're disturbing. So people will call something art, and it can be very offensive. But they claim, oh, I'm free to speak as I wish. This is art. I have to be free to express myself. Well, you also have to follow and respect the moral order. And they say this over and over again. Human dignity must be respected in communications. You can see I have an image there of a magazine rack from a supermarket. It's kind of an interesting little exercise to stand in line waiting to check out, to look over and count the number of times you can find the word sex. It's usually a dozen or so times. Right there. as you're waiting to check out. And these aren't articles about the beauty of married love and the theology of body. Unfortunately, probably wouldn't sell as well. Regarding the depiction of moral evil, Council Fathers had this to say: the chronicling, the description, or the representation of moral evil can, with the help of the means of social communication and with suitable dramatization, lead to a deeper knowledge and analysis of man, and to a manifestation of the true and good in all their splendor. So they see a place for depicting moral evil on the screen. They're not necessarily opposed to that, but it has to serve a higher purpose. They continue, if, however, this is to be more profitable than harmful to souls, the moral law, again, must be rigorously observed, especially when dealing with matters deserving respect or with matters that will lead too easily to base desires in man wounded by original sin. Okay, our TV shows are full of these matters that lead too easily to the base desires in man. They're a temptation to, they plant images in our minds, and they desensitize us to really horrific images. I have a little image there on the screen of a movie poster for Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D. Wasn't enough in 2D. Now you need to have the blood spraying at you. And I have right next to it a movie poster for Greater Glory. There we see in that movie a powerful depiction of martyrdom and struggles that are very violent, moral evils. But again, this has a purpose. It has a purpose, and it expresses a truth about the need that humanity has to be able to freely express their religion and to their faith and to live it out. So there's two examples. Violence in both films. One is not so good, the other's good. Another example I can think of, and I could go on and on, I suppose, but of gratuitous depictions of moral evil are those shows CSI and other crime dramas. I was entertained by those. I watched those, but honestly, what they show on the screen in prime time is really, really disturbing. And some of those images are in my mind. They're there. It's irresponsible for us to promote and foster this and support this sort of irresponsible depictions of moral evil. Okay. Well, one more. Another movie. Well, I'll move on to the next here. Next, the document, the Council Fathers, began to talk about obligations. We like to talk about obligations. They talk about, first, the obligations of media consumers. So when we pick up our newspapers and we flip through the channels, we do so mindlessly a lot of times, but we do have certain obligations. One of the first things they mention is a properly motivated selectivity. We need to avoid whatever might be a cause or occasion of spiritual harm. We should take appropriate steps to direct and form our consciences so that we can resist the less wholesome influences and seek out and profit from the good. They also talk about moderation and discipline. You know, it's easy to, at the end of the day, rather than to sit in quiet and pray, to fill the house with noise and turn on the TV. I know my own father was this way. He couldn't stand the quiet. He would flip the TV on even if he wasn't in the room. He just needed to hear noise. He couldn't stand the silence. Well, we need to face that silence. We need to be disciplined in our use, and we have to be moderate in how much time we spend. If we're going to focus on our real goal in life, heaven, growth in sanctity, growth in virtue, avoidance of vice. Next, they talked about obligations of parents. And other documents go into this in much greater detail, but they say the parents have the duty to see that entertainments and publications which might endanger faith and morals do not enter into their houses, and that their children are not exposed to them elsewhere. I'm afraid a lot of times parents are a little bit unaware of how readily available things are. Kids should never have unfiltered internet access in their homes. If your child has an iPod, an iPad, different things like that, and I know that things that kids look at on these. Some parents think it's a music player. You can browse the web in their bedroom, and it's the duty of the parent to keep unwholesome things out of the house and to realize the ways it can get in. So there needs to be a little education there, and so on. Next, they talk about the obligations of media producers, and the Council Fathers are quite aware of how powerful media producers are. They have the power to direct mankind along a good path or an evil path by the information they impart and the pressure they exert. Media organizations, they say, should police themselves by taking public pledges and establishing organizations and watchdogs to make sure that what is being portrayed is fair, that it is complete and true. It will be for them to regulate economic, political, and artistic values in a way that does not conflict with the common good. I have an assortment of logos down there, and we're all kind of aware, I hope, of the different biases that these different organizations have. If we're not, we should be. We should, for example, here's an exercise. Take a news story about something related to religion and go to, EWTN, CBS News, find an AP article that report on the same issue, if you can find them, and you'll see they're very different. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Then they continuing to talk about the obligation of media producers. If there's one thing I hope you know, they don't get religion. Mainstream movie studios and so on, they really do not get, and they're not interested in understanding the nuances of real traditional religions. For example, we see here a picture of Avatar, Bill Maher's Religulous, and then some crime movie, I haven't seen it, where they just use the images of religious sisters sort of as a prop or a mockery. The media competes with religious groups to be the main bearer of spiritual and religious insight. That's very true. People were fascinated by Avatar when it came out, and it was a beautiful film for the eyes, but it was also a very strange depiction of New Age ideas, completely at odds with Christianity. Now, there's, of course, little glimpses of truth in there, but also some very problematic things. This quote from a book that I used in my thesis is applicable here. The film industry has veered away from traditional religious themes, but continues to be fascinated by the spiritual and supernatural. There's a lot of movies out there about spiritual themes because we're spiritual beings. Of course, we're going to be curious. Unfortunately, they just haven't done a good job of really digging into this subject. The studies that have been done have found, of course, favorable portrayals of traditional religious characters and institutions has declined decade after decade. I think the bottom of the barrel must be Religulous. Has anyone seen that movie? Good. Nobody's seen it. It's Bill Maher. He found the most out there representatives of each group he could find and recorded them and presented them as if they were the mainstream normal religion. So he'll find a really out there Christian and say, this is what Christians are like. No. This is very prevalent. The little last bullet point there, the God Delusion was the #1 bestseller for a good amount of time in spirituality on Amazon, which if you've studied different things, theology and so on, then you go pick up a copy of the God Delusion, you realize it's really not even a very good book. Now, before I move back on to the next slide, I should mention the Council Fathers opened on a hopeful note. It's been a little bit of a downer here. They have great hope in the power of cinema to convey beautiful truth. Right now, there's not a lot of it going on, though. Next, they talked about the obligations of civil authorities. It is for the civil authority in its own domain to defend and safeguard, and especially in relation to the press, a true and just freedom of information, for the progress of modern society demands it. So our civil authority should be protecting our freedom of speech, and so on. That's not exactly happening to the extent we would like in our country, although we're still better than many nations. One example we see this is attempts to legislate discussions of marriage as being between one man and one woman as hate speech, things like that. That could become criminal to speak about that, and that's a reality in many nations. As a little side note, not exactly on the civil authority level, but technology company policies are often censoring and shaping what will be discussed and what positions will be held by large groups of people. And they do this through the technologies they themselves produce and maintain. Now I'm going to pick on Apple a little bit there. Got the Apple logo up there, but Google is much the same, as are many other companies. But for example, 2010, Apple revoked its approval of an application in the iPhone store. What's it called? Is it the iPhone store? Whatever. I have an Android phone. So in 2010, Apple revoked its approval of the Manhattan Declaration app. This declaration was a statement of Christian beliefs about marriage, the sanctity of life, and religious liberty. The reason given was that one of the points in the declaration was that homosexual conduct is immoral, and this, in Apple's view, was offensive. Later, they also censored an application called Exodus International from a Christian ministry that was trying to help people to leave the homosexual lifestyle. So those sorts of applications are not welcome in this market, which many people have access to right in their phones. So that's a problem. If the technologies that are so pervasive do not allow us to speak freely and express the truths that we know and hold without censorship, we won't be able to speak what we need to speak. Then they moved on to chapter 2, and it gets more practical. They start talking about what we need to do. All members of the church, they say, should make a concerted effort that the means of communication are put at the service of the multiple forms of the apostolate without delay, and as energetically as possible where and when they are needed. What they mean here, the multiple forms of the apostolate, they're talking about things like, well, EWTN would be a media apostolate, or Word on Fire, Father Robert Barron, well, many things. And all members of the church are called to be involved and to support these things. They say repeatedly that we have a duty to support and consume Catholic media. Pastors of souls, they tell us, should be zealous in this field. They need to be excellent communicators no matter what the medium. It is, after all, as the Council says, closely linked with their task of preaching. So being able to reach out to people where they are. For better or for worse, a lot of people, when they have a question about the faith, they turn to Google or the internet. And if we're not there to help provide an answer, someone else will. And so, pastors of souls need to be out there and accessible to those people looking in that space. Laymen, they say, who work professionally in these media should endeavor to bear witness to Christ. And again, this comes to the next presentation. The laity are called to sanctify the whole secular world. They're called to go out from Mass, as we say at the end of Mass, ite missa est, you are sent, go. Go out to your job at the TV station, the radio station, and in any job, and witness to Christ. Spread the gospel. The Fathers also encourage a responsible mainstream press and an authentically Catholic press. And I have the two images there, one of National Catholic Register, which seems, from my experience, to be pretty solid. They support the magisterium, and they don't try to change and distort doctrines and so on in their portrayal of them, whereas the National Catholic Reporter is problematic. Just recently, the bishop of the place, I can't remember where it is, the bishop of the place where they are published was, he's been doing this for years, trying to get them to come in line. They're constantly publishing articles in favor of things apparently like women's ordination or same-sex marriage, or questioning the Pope in different important matters. And that's not really the place for a Catholic publication that calls itself Catholic to be doing. So, and that is something else mentioned in the document. It's the responsibility of the bishop to oversee even the lay apostolates, media apostolates like the National Catholic Reporter and so on, within their boundaries, to make sure that the flock is protected from distortions and errors. Then they, continuing to get practical, they list all kinds of things. We need to have more and top-notch quality. You know, a lot of these Catholic films we have, if any of you were at that day of prayer where they talked about beauty at the University of Mary, they talked about beauty in art and in film and so on. And what's her name? Barbara Nicolosi? Yeah. I wasn't there, but I listened to it on the internet. She talked about how it's kind of sad that we have these Catholic movies that are kind of cheesy, you know? Why can't they be top-notch Hollywood productions? We shouldn't have to settle for less, because as Catholics, we make up a huge chunk of the society. If we're all these Catholics working in film, they should be infusing their Catholic faith into this realm of media. So that's part of the apostolate of the laity again. They called for decent radio and television programs, and that we as people should support them when we find them. They called for Catholic stations to be established wherever it's opportune. We've got Real Presence Radio in our diocese. It's a wonderful thing. And they again encourage us all to make use of these things if they are around. 5 minutes. I like this quote. "It would be shameful if Catholics, by their inactivity, allowed the Word of God to be silenced or obstructed by the technical difficulties which these media present and by their admittedly enormous cost." I do hear a lot of priests and so on say, well, I don't want to deal with this, like with a website or with different other, like a stewardship newsletter, things like this. These sorts of things are ways of reaching out. They can be expensive to get them done well, but they are worth it if done well. And in the conclusion of the document here, the bishops realize all this stuff they've been talking about it's related to human dignity, it's been related to theology and the duty to evangelize and the moral law. That's their area of expertise. They're not television producers and so on. So they delegate. They ask that a document be written to flesh these out in more detail. And they did. It was published in 1971, Communio et Progressio. It takes everything I've said and expands it much more with the help of experts in the field. It's an example of the kind of collaboration the Church desires. They say that the hope of the Council is the media, like salt and light, add savor to the earth and light to the world. And then the closing exhortation from the document, that we use media solely for the good of humanity, for its fate becomes more and more dependent upon their right use. Okay. All right, it's a lot of information for you, but now 2 short case studies before I finish and we take a break. Now, the March for Life. It's a huge event. I'm sure, raise your hand if you've been to the March for Life. Yeah, you guys have heard of it, right? Yeah. Okay. The reality is, I haven't heard an official estimate this year, but I've heard numbers from it's probably more than 500,000 to 650,000. I've heard those numbers thrown out. People gathered in Washington, D.C. in January to support life, the cause of life. It is called the Pro-Life March. But some Catholics, as I say, have never heard of this. Some Catholics, some of the couples I've been preparing for marriage, right when it was going on, they came and visited me, and the March for Life was going on. I said, so do you know what's happening in D.C.? I just asked out of curiosity. And they had a blank stare. They had no idea. And I thought, that's amazing. Then I asked them, did you hear about Mante Teo? Raise your hand if you've heard of him. Some of you. Yes. And of course, oh yeah, they'd heard about that. The story was a football player. I don't know all the details, but apparently he had some girlfriend on the internet that turned out to be fake, which is a whole nother talk about. But there was a study done. Well, there was a study done that showed which networks. ABC, NBC, and CBS gave 521 times more coverage to Monte Teo's fake dead girlfriend than it gave to the 500,000 people that marched in Washington, D.C. in the dead of winter. That's 147 minutes of coverage for the silly celebrity story and 17 seconds to the March for Life on the mainstream networks that so many people in our country watch. Another big news story that night, Subway, apparently if you go by a foot long, sometimes it's only 11 inches long. That got more coverage than 500,000 people marching in Washington, D.C. Now, we laugh about it and so on, but this is shaping debate. This is shaping policy. People don't think it's an issue because they don't hear about it. And what they do hear, I think that's the next slide, the media doesn't just ignore it, the mainstream media, they distort the message about the March for Life. USA Today in 2009, that was the stat I had. I'm sure it's the same today. They described the march as involving thousands of people. Well, 350,000. It's not technically wrong, but if you just say thousands, you get the impression that it was just a small march because, you know. Also, the CNN photo that the photo that CNN chose for one of their stories on the March for Life, probably the only story, in 2010 is typical. Keep abortion legal. It's the pro-life march with hundreds of thousands of protesters marching for life. This photo shows up over and over again of pro-choice protesters. And there are only a handful of them there. Apparently, I haven't been there myself. I should go, but apparently it's hard to find a pro-choice protester. Is that right? Yes, people are nodding their heads. Well, CNN manages to do it. What else was I going to say here? In addition, the language, as I said, using the word thousands when it's 500,000, you will not often find even the title of the march, March for Life. They will not use that. Instead, they will use language such as abortion foes, or abortion rights opponents. This sort of language is actually codified in the Associated Press Manual of Style, so on. As Inter Mirifica pointed out, this is dangerous and problematic, and we should loudly protest, and this is part of what the document urges, protest at having been lied to, and we should support and encourage media that is less hostile to the truth. We should be supportive of EWTN as one example of, among many, and a growing number of good media outlets. EWTN was one of the only ones that provided coverage that was widely available about the event, even though, a few days later there was a gun control, and I'm not saying anything about the merits of that debate at all, where about 1,000 people showed up in Washington, D.C. days after or before the March for Life, and that got a lot of media coverage. This big rally was 1,000 people. Well, there were just 500,000 or more. Well, I'm running out of time. I better move along here to Vatican Council II itself. Now, this was sort of a gift to us from Pope Benedict XVI here at the end of his pontificate. Recently, after having announced his resignation, or his retirement, or abdication, or whatever you want to call it, he met with the clergy in Rome, the clergy of Rome, his priests, and he began his talk rather apologetically. He said, "For today, given the conditions of my age, I could not prepare a great real address, as one might expect, but I thought about chatting about the Second Vatican Council as I saw it." And he went on to talk for a long time about his memories of the Vatican Council, and he spoke very fondly of it, even joking a little bit and laughing. But he got down to a very interesting part that I found fascinating. He continued, "So we went to the council not only with joy, but with enthusiasm. The expectation was incredible. We hoped that everything would be renewed, that a new Pentecost really would come, a new era of the church, because the church was not robust enough at that time. The Sunday practice was still good," he says. "Even vocations to the priesthood and religious life were already somewhat fewer, but still sufficient." This is the time of the council. But then, he goes on, "There was the council of the fathers, the true council, but there was also the council of the media. It was almost a council in and of itself, and the world perceived the council through them, through the media. So immediately, effectively, the council that got through to the people was that of the media, not of the fathers. And if you go back and read news articles that were printed during the council, there's all kinds of crazy speculation. And that's what's going on. The Pope continued, the council of journalists did not naturally take place within the world of faith, but within the categories of the media today. Hermeneutic of politics, he goes on. It's about a power struggle between different currents within the church. There was a discussion about the decentralization of the church, the power of the bishops, and then through the people of God. Let me skip down for time's sake here. At the end of his talk, he says, and we know that this council of the media was accessible to all. So dominant, more efficient, this council created many calamities, so many problems, so much misery. In reality, seminaries closed, convents closed, liturgy was trivialized, and the true council struggled to materialize, to be realized. The virtual council was stronger than the real council, but the real strength of the council was present, and slowly it has emerged and is becoming the real power which is also true reform, true renewal of the church. So he ends on a hopeful note. But he points out that when media coverage is not done well, in accord with what is true and good and fair, it really causes problems in society. And Pope Benedict seems to put a large chunk of what happened in our church after Vatican II, a lot of the problems we've seen, on the shoulders of this media frenzy. Not entirely, of course, but... So let me close with this quote from a different document, but very relevant. The media can be used to proclaim the gospel, or reduce it to silence in human hearts. As media become ever more intertwined with people's daily lives, they influence how people understand the meaning of life itself. Indeed, the power of media extends to defining not only what people will think, but even what they will think about. Reality for many is what the media recognize as real. What media do not acknowledge seems of little importance. The March for Life. Thus, de facto silence can be imposed upon individuals and groups whom the media ignore, and even the gospel can be muted, though not entirely stilled in this way.
Recorded in the Diocese of Bismarck, North Dakota.